Hello. So far, we have learned in chapter 1 the market, what is there to buy. In chapter 2, how much we can buy, the budget constraint. And in this chapter, chapter 3, we'll understand which of the goods or rather which consumption bundles we prefer. So, what is the meaning of a consumption bundle? Consumption bundle essentially means the entire basket of goods which you are going to consume. Now, if I talk about consumption bundle and if it contains, let's say, hundreds of goods, now it is definitely not an easy exercise for us to start any kind of a conceptual exercise. So to simplify this, what we can do is we can resort to a two good consumption bundle. Now you may say that it is a quite specific case, and does this generally hold good? Our insights which we derive from this two goods consumption bundle, does it hold good in a general scenario? So the answer is yes, because you can think of it in this way that let's say good 1 is a good which you are really concerned about, and good 2 could be concerned with all the other goods, right? So this is a kind of a mathematical simplification which you can perform. So essentially what we will be covering in this chapter is which consumption bundles you prefer and why you prefer, and that is the name of this chapter as well, preferences. So when we talk about preferences, we have to understand few ideas, and then we will talk about few assumptions and axioms of our consumer preference. When we talk about consumer preferences, there are essentially three things which we are looking for. What are those three things? The first thing is weakly preferred. Second thing would be indifferent. And third thing would be your strongly preferred or strictly. I can say just strictly preferred. Now, what is the meaning of these guys? Weak preference, indifference, and strict preference. When I say I weakly prefer a consumption bundle over the other, what I mean is it's like a greater than equal to kind of a thing. So what we will write here is like this. Now, the meaning of this guy over here is essentially if you talk about consumption bundle A and consumption bundle B. Now remember, consumption bundle is a collection of goods. So you weakly prefer A to B. It's a consumption bundle. Now weakly prefer means that either you prefer them in the same way or you prefer A slightly better than B. So given a choice between B and A, you will either prefer A or you will be indifferent between A and B. Meaning to say this, that on some days you might say that A and B are equally good to me, and on some days you might say that A is better than B, right? Now what is the other case? The other case is your indifference. Now I can say indifference is like this. Now indifference meaning that I will always say that A and B are equal to me in terms of preference. Now what about strict preference? For strict preference, what you have to understand is I strictly prefer one of the consumption bundles. So over here I am strictly preferring A over B, right? So let's have a summary. Weakly preference denoted by this means A is weakly preferred to B, which means A is either as good as B or greater than B. Now, what about indifference? It says that A is equal to B in terms of preference. Now, this strict preference meaning A is strongly or strictly preferred to B, which means I'll always prefer A over B. So these are the three things which you had to remember when we start about the discussion on preference. Now, having understood this, let's just head on to few axioms of consumer preferences or assumptions of consumer preferences. So to begin with, let's start with complete. What do we mean by complete? So let us say you have a lot of consumption bundles to choose from, and if you can completely rank all the consumption bundles. The meaning of rank is, let's understand in terms of completeness. I can always take two consumption bundles and would be able to say whether I weakly prefer one consumption bundle over the other, or I am indifferent between them, or I strongly prefer one of the consumption bundles. So I can do this over all choices. What about reflexive? Reflexive means that you can at least say that the consumption bundle which you are considering is as at least as good as itself. This is more like a kind of a more philosophical and more mathematical exercise, but for our purpose, even if you do not really find it meaningful, it's okay. But as you progress ahead in more chapters in your post graduation, you'll understand that this has some kind of an advantage or some kind of usefulness. So as of now, this is for no meaning as of now. When you feel that this is obvious, right? Let's first take of completion. Just understand there's something called reflexive property, which says that any good or rather any consumption bundle is as good as at least as good as itself, right? What about the transitive nature? For transitive, you can say that, let us say you have three consumption bundles A, B, and C, and you say that I weakly prefer A over B, and I also weakly prefer B over C. So I can summarize this using this way. And if transitive property holds or transitive assumption or axiom hold, then I can write this directly as A weakly preferred to C. So what I have done is, it's pretty simple. I have removed out the intermediary, right? Now this has some kind of a logical understanding to it or some kind of a logical reasoning behind it, because let us say you are saying that you prefer A over B and B over C, and then suddenly you say that no, I also prefer C over A. Now this is something which is definitely not logical as per our assumptions are concerned, because in that case, using this logic, the earlier logic, you prefer A over B, then B over C. Then natural logical deduction is you prefer A over C, right? Because given a choice between three bundles, A, B and C, so if you prefer B over C, if I give you something better than B, definitely you will choose that better thing, not C. But if you are saying that you choose C over the better thing than B, definitely there is some kind of a logical flaw in this. But having said that, consumers generally are not computers, so they can have this kind of a preference as well. But for our elementary purpose, for our basic understanding of consumer preferences, we will be considering transitive as given, right? We will not be considering this kind of a situation. So this is ruled out for our purposes. We will be considering only this kind of a preference relation. So what all things which you have to remember? Complete. This is important. If this is not true, then obviously you cannot compare between all the consumption bundles. Now reflexive. Now this is something which has a mathematical and philosophical ease to it, so you can leave it for now. And transitive. Transitive obviously has some kind of a logical basis to it. If it's not transitive, definitely you land into very strange kind of situations. Yes. So this is the basic idea about axioms of consumer preferences. Now let's try to understand these things a bit more graphically and mathematically. As we are considering two goods consumption bundles, so let's denote that thing. Let's say X is your consumption bundle, right? So X is essentially a combination of two goods, X1 and X2. Now if you had, let's say 3-4 goods in the consumption bundle, I would have said that X is X1, X2 and so on, right? So if you have n goods, X1, X2 till Xn. So for our case, we just have two goods. So X meaning X1, X2 pair. So let us say you have a consumption bundle somewhere around here. This point as X1, X2. This thing over here is your X1 and this thing over here is your X2. Now what about if I ask you which are the goods which you strictly prefer over this or weakly prefer over this? So what will you do is you will plot all the points, or rather you will denote all the consumption bundles on this chart which I weakly prefer over this. So how will we plot that? Now let's say these points above this x1 x2 and above this line are the consumption bundles which you weakly prefer to x1 x2. So what will you call the consumption bundles on this region? Weakly preferred set, right? So in this set, all the consumption bundles will be weakly preferred as compared to this point over here, this consumption bundle which you have. And what about this boundary? This boundary will become your indifference curve. Now why it will become your indifference curve? Because on this boundary you will prefer all the consumption bundles in the same way. So you will have a kind of indifference between all the consumption bundles on this line, and that way this will become your indifference curve. Now there's an important property about indifference curves which you must know. Let's say this is your indifference curve and this is one of the consumption bundles which you have, right? Let me just write it as XA, right? Capital XA. And from here you are kind of assuming that you can also draw another indifference curve, right? So let's just, for the sake of assumption, let's draw another indifference curve through this same consumption bundle. So what will this mean? This will mean that, let's say you have this as a consumption bundle, this as a consumption bundle, and this as a consumption bundle. So this is your XB and this is your XC. What does this mean? This means that as you're seeing that I can draw two indifference curves through this XA bundle, first of all you will say that XA is indifferent to XB, right? And you will also say that XA is indifferent to XC. Now if I combine both of these guys, you will get XA is indifferent to XB is indifferent to XC. Now does this really mean something meaningful? Doesn't. Because why? Because if I think about my weak preference set, this is my weak preference set, right? And I know that the boundary is your indifference curve or your indifference line or your indifference consumption bundles, and above what you will have is your strict preference, because your weakly preferred set contains the indifference curve. And if you take out the indifference curve and just think of the upper part, that will be your strict preference. So according to your weakly preferred set criteria, XC is not weakly preferred, it's strongly preferred or strictly preferred to XA. So according to this logic, we know that XC is definitely strictly preferred to XA, and according to this logic you will say that XA is your weak indifferent to XC, which makes no sense. This goes on to prove that your indifference curves cannot intersect, or rather from a consumption bundle you can only draw one indifference curve. You cannot have multiple difference curves. If we have understood this much, we can safely go on to few known preferences like perfect substitutes and perfect complements, right? So let's just head on to perfect substitutes first. So what is the intuitive understanding about perfect substitutes? For perfect substitutes, what we do is, in a consumption bundle of two goods, you prefer the same amount of good 1 and good 2, right? What I mean is, let's say I give you an offer that I will give you 100 units of good 1, and in another offer I'll give you 100 units of good 2. You will be indifferent between these two choices. Either you will take the 100 good 1 or you will take the 100 good 2. Now let's take an example of this. So let's say you have two pen manufacturers and you are kind of like indifferent between these pen manufacturers, right? So what you say is, let's say you have a brand A and brand B. So when you go to the market, you do not have any preference between brand A and brand B. You say that give me either brand A or brand B. So it becomes a classic case of a perfect substitute, because your brand A can be substituted for brand B and vice versa. So how will you plot this kind of a situation on your graph? Now this is your case of indifference between two goods in that consumption bundle. Now why will this be a case of perfect substitutes? Let's understand this. Because if I take this point over here, any point, let's say, just think about this as x1 and x2, right? Now over here you will understand that, let me say that this is my y-intercept. My y-intercept is, let's say, some A, and let's say my b-intercept is some kind of a B. Okay, now if I have to give you an understanding of this, you can say that I can find out the equation for this line. What will the equation for this line? The equation for this line will be nothing but x1 upon B plus x2 upon A is equal to 1, right? So if I tell you that this is my case of indifference curve for perfect substitutes, what does this mean? This means that let's say I also give you one other condition, that A is equal to B, right? So in that case you can further simplify this as x1 plus x2, and this will be equal to your B, which means that sum of the two goods in the bundle must be equal to B. What does this thing even mean in terms of substitutes? It means that give me either 0B or B0 or 1, B minus 1 or B minus 1, 1, and so on. It means that you really do not care whether you are getting more of good one or more of good two, as long as the sum is the same. So this is the classic case of your perfect substitutes. Now over here we have taken a simplification of A equal to B. Now when A is not equal to B, you will have kind of a proportion, right? And over here this will give you that proportion in which you prefer A over B, and rather you are not preferring also, you are indifferent over this, right? So let's say there is a pen which is kind of helps you in writing more, right, but it has a higher price, right? So maybe you will have some kind of a relationship between x1 and x2, pen A and pen B, but that will be kind of a fixed relation, right? And it's as they both are kind of a substitute for you because they do the same job of writing. So you will have some kind of preference on terms of the ratio, not in terms of which you prefer more. It's just a matter of a ratio over here. But let's say if the ratio is 1:1, in that case you are not even worried about that ratio. You are like indifferent between which good you are getting in which quantity. But if A is not equal to B, even in that situation it's kind of a substitute, but that is kind of a more general form of a substitute, right? But in most of the questions which you will be getting in your exams, you will be considering only this case when A is equal to B, but you might get questions in which A is not equal to B. But do not get confused, even that is the case of your substitutes, right? Now let's move on to complements or perfect complements. A classic case of complements will be that, let's say you're buying a pen, so you need some kind of a paper or a notebook. So pen and paper are your complements, right? And if you have, let's say, 100 of pens and just one piece of paper, you will not be able to use pens properly. So you need some kind of a complementary relationship between pen and paper, right? And that relationship is captured by your perfect complements. Okay, so let's try to understand how will we draw the indifference curves for perfect complements. Now perfect complements could be pen and paper, could be sugar and tea powder, or it could be milk and sugar, it could be pizza and coke. Now whatever you may prefer. So let's say this is a point which you are right now, which is x1 comma x2. Now if I give you more of x1, right, will I make you better off? No, I will not, because I need some kind of a relationship between x and x2, right? Because they are complements. Because if I, let's say, give you 2 pens and 100 pieces of paper or 100 units of paper, So maybe your 2 pens will be exhausted in those 100 units of paper, and if I give you more paper or more pen, obviously you will not be able to use the pen or paper respectively, right? So if I give you more of good one and do not give you good two, in that situation you will be indifferent, because you'll not be able to use the more of good one, because you need more of good two as well along with it. So what's the other case? If I give you more of good two and do not give you the good one, in that situation also you'll have the same problem, that I need more of good one along with more of good two, or else I'll be indifferent. So along this line you will be indifferent, because it's not improving your happiness or your how would I put it, your usefulness, right? So this is a point, and if you go horizontally or vertically, you will have the same kind of usefulness of the consumption bundles. So you say that I am not going to prefer any consumption bundle on this line, or rather on these two lines over this. So this becomes your indifference curve for perfect complements. So you have understood so far that what is perfect substitutes and what is perfect complements, and you also understood how to draw the indifference curves for the same. Is everything that you consume good and you do not buy anything which is bad? Think about it. Do you really value everything with a positive sense of the term good, or you can term them as bad or rather neutral? So let's just think about it, and let's, for the sake of theoretical understanding, classify items into goods, bads and neutrals, and let's understand what do we mean by this. Good is something which is liked by you. You have some kind of positive utility associated with it. The more you get of it, you feel better about it. Now what is a bad? Bad is exactly the opposite of it. Bad is something which you really do not like to have or consume or buy. More you get, more bad you feel. So it has a negative utility, or rather a disutility associated with it. Now you can say that doing some kind of a manual labor is a bad, but if I give you some kind of a reward for that, maybe it can be some kind of a fuzzy there. But still, if I have to just give you a manual labor, and that manual labor always be a bad, because more you do of it, you will feel bad about it. Now what about a neutral? Neutral is something which you really do not care about. I mean, whatever the amount of neutral you have or you buy, you really do not get any extra utility or any utility whatsoever. So with this understanding, let's just think about few graphical interpretation of this, and let's just have good in the x-axis always and have bad and neutrals in the y-axis when we need to do. And we also can do one more thing, that we can denote goods as G, bads as your B, and neutrals as your N. If you look at the first diagram, both the goods are good essentially, and in the x-axis you have your standard good, which I'll be using in all the diagrams. In the y-axis we have good. So x, y both have good in this particular diagram. So over here you can see that if I decrease the x-axis good, I'll have to compensate it with y-axis good, because both are goods. So it's like if I decrease one good, I have to increase the other good. That happens when you have two goods in your consumption bundle. Now let's move to a different case in which we have x-axis again is a good and y-axis is a bad. When you have this kind of a situation, if I decrease your good, which is the x-axis, you will definitely have to compensate it with a decrease in bad as well, because if I decrease your good, you will be less happy. So if I have to make you more happy, I have to decrease your bad, which makes an intuitive sense. So that is what happens when you have a bad in the y-axis and good in the x-axis. Now let's move to a different case when we have, let's say, a neutral in the y-axis and a good in the x-axis. In that particular scenario, you can just think about it that no matter what is the quantity of your neutral, you will have the same utility. So it's pretty obvious to see that our vertical line will be your utility. So no matter what is the y value or the y-axis value, I have the same utility. That's the idea about of a neutral y-axis and a good x-axis. Now you can think here that is good something like more is always better, because till now we have classified items into good, bad and neutral, and we have understood what is the interaction between good bad and good neutral. Now let's understand what is the analysis or what is the insight when I increase both of your goods and you have two goods. You do not have any bad, you just have two goods. So if I keep on increasing your good, will you always be happy? Let us say I give you a glass of Coca-Cola and a burger, so you might be happy. So can I continuously give you glasses of Coca-Cola and burgers and you will be always happy? So just think about it. So to understand this, let's have some kind of a concentric utility functions, and if you increase your utility, you have to kind of get towards an ideal point, because you might have an kind of an ideal hunger that this is the amount of burgers you can eat, this is the amount of Coke you can have. So that's the bliss point to say. So if you think about your ideal consumption of any food combination, you will have necessarily something like a bliss point always. But what about something like money and better house? Now you might say that more of money and more of better house is always good for you, so you might think that increasing both of them will always make you happier. Now obviously these are pretty simplistic viewpoints, and this is just like your ABC of economics of preferences. Now definitely in this particular video, all you had to understand was that not everything is good, and you will not enjoy more of good always. You will maybe reach a bliss point in particular situations. Having understood a lot about preferences, about substitutes, complements, indifference curves, then goods, bads, neutrals, and bliss point, and so on, we will be heading on to more in-depth conceptual understanding of well-behaved preferences. Now, what do we mean by well-behaved preferences? This is just a fancy way of saying that we will be focusing on a very specific type of preference, and we call that well-behaved preference. And we resort to that kind of a preference because that is easier to deal with as far as mathematical and microeconomic analysis is concerned. So let's understand what are the assumptions of well-behaved preferences. So essentially you have three assumptions. Now let me list them first. So first is more is always better. Second is averages are preferred to extremes. And the third is just an extension of the second. We strictly prefer the average to extremes. Let's go to each of them in detail. Let's say you have two bundles. Bundles meaning a set of goods. X1, Y1 and Z1. This is your bundle 1. Now what about the other bundle? X2, Y2, Z2. Now I tell you that X1 is greater than equal to X2, Y1 is greater than equal to Y2, Z1 is greater than equal to Z2, and an added information that X1 is also strictly greater than X2. Now I could have said X1 greater than X2, or just Y1 greater than Y2, or just Z1 greater than Z2. Now why I'm trying to give you this description? Because when I say more is better, I have to make one bundle strictly more than the other. So if I just say that this bundle has all the goods same in the same quantity as this bundle, I'm not creating more. To create more, I need to at least give one good in a larger quantity. and that is why this is the description of more. Now I will tell you, if this is the condition of more will be better, which means that let's say this is your bundle 1 and this is your bundle 2. I will always prefer bundle 1 to bundle 2. Now the reason is more is better. It's as simple as this. Now we also called this as
monotonous,
monotonicity of preferences, or simply monotonous preferences. Now let's move to the next one. The second assumption for well-behaved preference is averages are preferred to extremes. What does this mean? Let's say you have two bundles, bundle 1 and bundle 2. And just for the sake of simplicity, we have just two goods. This will have x1 and y1. This will have x2 and y2. So these are our extremes, and let's also assume that these two bundles are on the same indifference curve, which means that you are indifferent between these two bundles. In that case, if I take a weighted average of these two guys, I will have a preferred bundle. Now what do I mean by an average? Let's say I take half of x1 and half of x2. This will be my new x, and I take half of y1 and half of y2. This will be my new y. So this is going to be your new bundle, and averages are preferred to extremes. So B1, B2 are indifferent to each other, but this new bundle, B3 bundle, will essentially be preferred, I can say this symbol, to B1, B2. So essentially B3 is preferred to B1 and B2. Now what does this tell you about the shape of the indifference curve? So the first assumption which we built, more is better, has some kind of a relationship with averages to extremes assumption as well, because if we combine the first two, we will understand that we will have a convex kind of a preference structure, which means this kind of a structure. Now why do we have this kind of a convex kind of a structure? Now let's understand the first assumption. First assumption was more is better. So if more is better, and let's say I am at this point somewhere here, right, and if I move in this direction and then this direction, so essentially I'm moving somewhere in this direction, right? So in that sense, I'm decreasing both the goods. So I will be worse off because more is better. And if I move in this direction and this direction, it means I'm increasing both the goods, so I'll be better off. Which means that this direction will give you better off and this direction will give you worse off. So the only relation which you are left out is this direction, which means your indifference curve must be sloping downwards, because this is better, this is worse. So you have to have some kind of a direction in which you are neither better neither worse, you are indifferent. So downward sloping indifference curve because of the first assumption, more is better. What about averages to extremes? So if I take, let's say, this point and this point, these two guys are on the same indifference curve, which means let's say this is my B1 and this is my B2. So I am essentially indifferent between B1 and B2. But what about the average? Let's take an example of an average. So let me connect a line here and let's think of this as my average, right? Now the thing is, over here I have given half, but it's not really necessary. I could have given it small t 1 minus t, small t 1 minus t, because over here averages does not mean equal weights, it is weighted average. So I could also modify this to say weighted averages is preferred to extremes, right? So this guy over here is your B3. Let me write B3. So B3, you can see, is above than this indifference curve. Let me label this indifference curve like this. So this indifference curve is below to B3, and all the points on this line essentially are weighted averages of B2 and B1. So they are above this indifference curve. So all the points on this line will be preferred to this indifference curve, or they will lie on a higher indifference curve, right? So that is the idea of averages are preferred to extremes. Now, can we have some other kind of indifference curve which doesn't obey this averages to extreme assumption? Yes, definitely. Let's look at them as well. So what about I tell you that this is my indifference curve? In that case, if I connect 2 points over here, you can pretty well see that there are points which are above, there are points which are below. So this definitely is a non-convex indifference curve. Let's take another example. Another example could be just the opposite of this. Let's say I have this kind of an indifference curve. In that situation, you just have the opposite, meaning the entire line connecting the two bundles is below. So you can also say that this is your concave, this is convex, non-convex, this is concave. We will talk about more about convexity, concavity in mathematical economics lectures, but as of now this is just to say that when you have to think about convex indifference curve, just think about this, that line connecting two bundles will always be above the indifference curve, that is your strictly convex, which is a good segue to the third assumption. The third assumption, I'll not write it over here because that's not important very much. The third assumption is we have strict convex preference. Now, what is strict convexity? This is an example of strict convexity. Now, what is not so strict, or I should say just convexity? For that, I will just give you the example of substitutes. You remember substitutes has this kind of an indifference curve. So this is convex, but it is not strictly convex. So it is obeying the first two assumptions. More is better, averages to extremes, but it is not obeying the third assumption, which is averages are strictly preferred to extremes. Not just preferred, strictly preferred. This is just preferred, this is strictly preferred. This is just convex, this is strictly convex. This is non-convex, this is concave. So I hope you understood the idea of well-behaved preferences. What is marginal rate of substitution, or simply known as MRS? The indifference curve looks something like this, when this is your first code and this is your second code. So this indifference curve will definitely have a slope at every point. So the slope of this indifference curve at every point is known as marginal rate of substitution, or MRS. So if you give up a small amount of good 1, you have to be compensated with a small amount of good 2, so that you remain on the same indifference curve and you are as well off as you were before. So if you Consider this as delta x1 and this as delta x2. So you can think of this slope of this indifference curve as delta x2 upon delta x1. Now definitely over here I am talking about small changes, so I'll have to change this delta symbol to d. So dx2 upon dx1, and this will be your slope at every point on the indifference curve, which is known as the MRS or the marginal rate of substitution for that indifference curve at that very point. Now let's move on to the economic interpretations of MRS. So let us take three indifference curves and let's choose the middle one and let's put a slope on at some point here. This is the tangent at this point and the slope of this will be the MRS. So if I take the slope of this and I find that MRS at this point was equal to minus 2. What does this mean? This means that I'm ready to give up 2 units of good 2 in order to gain 1 unit of good 1. If you look at this point and try to understand the meaning of the slope, if I go 1 unit forward and I have to go 2 units down, that is the meaning of minus 2. So it means that I am ready to give up 2 units of my good 2 in order to gain 1 unit of good 1 at this very point. Over here when I'm saying 1 and 2, don't take it literally because the slope will definitely change when you consume 1 extra unit of good. So think in terms of per unit terms, that at that point if I increase my quantity of good 1 by a very small amount, I'll have to decrease the twice for my good 2. That is the understanding of your MRS at that point through the help of slope. The underlying principle here is essentially the rate which is giving me the rate of indifference, or how I am going to substitute one good for the other, keeping me indifferent, right? Now let's say I don't want to keep you indifferent, I want to move you away from the indifference curve, I want to tempt you, then I'll have to give you different terms of trade, right? So let me give you an exchange rate capital E which is equal to minus 3. Now what is the meaning of an exchange rate of minus 3? So let's again take this point and try to draw a line with a slope of minus 3. So this is going to give you an exchange rate of minus 3. Now what does that mean? This means that if I have to offer you 1 extra of good 1, you will have to part up with 3 units of your good 2, right? Now don't take these diagrams to scale because obviously I have drawn freehand diagram. In this case definitely you will be willing to move towards the upper direction, right? Which means you would not like to part away with your good 2, because in that case if let's say you give up your good 2 in order to gain more of good 1, you will move to the right bottom, which is a lower indifference curve. So you see, when I give you an exchange rate which is of a greater value in absolute terms than your MRS, you would like to move towards good 2. And what is the other case? Let's say I offer you an exchange rate of minus 1. So let me draw that line for you. So going ahead with my limited drawing capacities, this is your line with an exchange rate of minus 1, right? When you give the consumer 1 extra unit of good 1, he will have to part away with just 1 extra unit of good 2. So it's like 1 for 1. 1 extra in good 1 means 1 less in good 2, right? Now if you look at this blue line, dark blue line, if you give me more of good 2, then definitely I will move towards a lesser indifference curve. That's not agreeable to me. But if you give me more of good 1, I will move to a higher indifference curve, right? Because it will be above this indifference curve, which means when E in absolute terms is less than the MRS, I will like to consume more of good 1. When E is equal to MRS equal to -2, it means you would not like to trade with me because you will not be better off or worse off by trading with me. So when the exchange rate is equal to MRS, you would not like to trade, and when the exchange rate is greater than MRS. Now when I say greater than MRS, take in terms of the absolute values, because MRS is definitely a negative number in most cases. So when the exchange rate is greater than MRS in absolute terms, you would like to consume more of good 2, and when this is the opposite, you will like to consume more of good 1. And when the exchange rate is equal to MRS, you have no benefits of trading. The concept of MRS is not restricted to just 2 goods. Now I can say that good 2 is the extra money which I have, or I can say just money. This is the money which I still have after buying good 1. So this is my good 1, and the rest of the money is spent on all the other goods, right? This is spent on all goods. So what does MRS mean in this case? Now this thing you can consider as marginal willingness to pay. So what does that mean? It means that if you would like to consume 1 extra of good 2, how much money you will have to part away with, which makes a lot of sense, because when I say MRS is equal to -2, it means that I'll have to give up 2 units of good 2 in order to gain 1 unit of good 1. So if my good 2 is money, it means that I'll have to part away with 2 units of money or currency to get 1 extra of good 1. Now the key thing over here, as the Varian chapter mentions, is that stress on marginal and willingness. So when I say marginal, it means that extra, very small amount from the point where I am in. So 1 and 2 is something which I am saying you for explanation purposes, but definitely you cannot have 1 extra from that point. That will change the MRS of itself. So you have to think in terms of small changes, right? So that's marginal for you. What's willingness? Now when I say willingness, what I mean is that is something which I would like to do, I am willing to do, but ultimately the price is not dependent on your likeness. It is dependent on various lots of other factors as well. So the price at which the good is trading in, the price of good 1, essentially P1, is going to be very different than the MRS in lot of cases. But let's say your price over here of good 1 is less than MRS, so definitely you would like to trade here, you would like to have more of good 1. If you look at this indifference curve in red, good 1 is in the x-axis and good 2 is in the y-axis, and over here you can see I have drawn 3 tangents, T1, T2 and T3, and essentially the slope of these tangents will be the MRS values. So from here we will get the MRS of the point over here, and then from here we will get the MRS of point over here, and from here we will get the MRS of point 3. Now you can very much understand over here intuitively that MRS is falling in an absolute sense because the value will be negative, but in an absolute sense it will be falling. Why? Because think about it, it has become less and less steep. It was somewhat steep here, lesser steepness, then it has become flatter. So you can say that mod of MRS1 is greater than mod of MRS2, which is greater than mod of MRS3. When you have a strictly convex indifference curve, you will have a diminishing MRS in the case of strictly convex indifference curve. So this is a very good way to check the convexity of your indifference curve. Let's discuss the end of the chapter questions of chapter 3 of Varian textbook. The first question says, if we observe a consumer choosing a bundle when a different bundle is available one time, are we justified in concluding that the chosen bundle is strictly preferred to the not chosen bundle? Definitely you cannot say that. Why? Because remember, when you choose one bundle over the other, it could be because of two reasons. One, you weakly prefer one bundle to the other, and the second is you strictly prefer the first bundle, which means we cannot directly say it's weakly or strictly, and the question is saying, is it strictly? So no. Now we have now three questions. I will keep on displaying one after the other. All of the three are very similar to each other. The next question says that consider a group of people A, B, C and the relation at least as tall as in A is at least as tall as B. So it's like an example given to you that you can think of the relation as something like this, that some person is at least as tall as the other person. Is this relation transitive? Is it complete? Now think about transitive. Without losing generality, if I say that A is at least as tall as B and B is at least as tall as C, so can we not say that A is at least as tall as C? You can take Steve, John and Jimmy. If Steve is at least as tall as John, John is at least as tall as Jimmy, so definitely Steve is at least as tall as Jimmy, so it's transitive. Now is it complete? Now complete means that can we compare all the possible things, or rather can we have this relation identified for all sets of people? Yes, because you will be either taller or equal to the height, right? At least as tall as. So yes, it's complete. Now next is take the same group of people and consider the relation strictly taller than. So is it transitive? Yes, again, because again take Steve, John, Jimmy. Steve greater than John, John greater than Jimmy. So obviously Steve greater than Jimmy. Now is it reflexive? Now what does reflexive mean? Reflexive means that can you have that relationship with yourself? Definitely not. You cannot be taller than yourself. So it's not reflexive. Is it complete? No, it is not complete, because again two people could have the same height, right? So you cannot have that relationship of strictly taller than. Next question says that a college football coach says that given two linemen A and B, he always prefers the one who is bigger and faster. Is this preference relation transitive? Is it complete? Now there are two things which he is considering, bigger and faster. But if I combine bigger and faster, you might have a situation that I could find two people such that one is bigger and the other is faster. So how will you compare then? Obviously it cannot be complete, because you cannot rank all people, as I gave you the example right now. Is this preference relation transitive? Now think about it. Again take three people. You have Steve, John, Jimmy. Steve bigger and faster than John. John bigger and faster than Jimmy. So definitely Steve is bigger and faster than Jimmy. So you have transitive relationship. Next question says, can an indifference curve cross itself? Yes, indifference curve can cross itself. The only thing is two indifference curves cannot cross. One indifference curve can cross itself. Next question is related to the previous question. Could this figure be a single indifference curve if preferences are monotonic? So now the question is important and kind of revealing itself also, because in the previous question few people might have got confused that how is this indifference curve crossing itself, because we did not assume monotonicity. But when we have monotonicity, it means that more is better, right? Which means that if I give you more of all the goods, you will be better off. So in that sense figure 3.2 is not possible, because over here you can see that the indifference curves are crossing and there are points on the indifference curve which have more of both the goods, and still you're saying that you will be indifferent. How is that possible? Next question is, if both pepperoni and anchovies are bats, will the indifference curve have a positive or a negative slope? it will have a negative slope. Next question is, why convex preferences means that averages are preferred to extremes? Simple, because if you have a convex preference, it means that the weighted average of any two extreme points on the indifference curve will be higher than the indifference curve. So that will lie on a higher indifference curve. What is the marginal rate of substitution of $1 bills for $5 bills? So depending upon which you take the first good and which you take the second good, it could be -1/5 or -5. If good 1 is neutral, what is the marginal rate of substitution for good 2? If one of the goods is neutral and over here the first good, so in that case the indifference curve will be horizontal, because if you keep on increasing the good one, you will be indifferent, right? So in that case the tangent will always be parallel, so slope will be equal to 0 or MRS will be equal to 0. Last question. Think of some other goods for which your preferences might be concave. The idea here is that you will prefer the extremes, not the weighted average, right? So if you're preferring the extremes and not the weighted average, it means that the combination of the goods are not good. So it's like milk and pizza. So think of your combinations which you do not enjoy, and those goods can be thought of as having concave preference. This concludes chapter 3, preferences.